Sir, she's here. The young hostess's voice trembled as she looked toward the Admiral standing a few feet away. The Admiral turned immediately. For a moment, the busy check-in area of the White House ceremony seemed to fall silent. My father was still standing beside me, proudly holding his VIP invitation. Only seconds earlier, he had been smirking. You weren't invited. Now, he looked confused. The Admiral walked directly toward me. Not toward my father. Toward me. Several military officers standing nearby suddenly straightened their posture. The Admiral extended his hand. Commander Emily Carter, he said warmly. We've been waiting for you. My father blinked. I could almost hear his thoughts racing. Waiting for me. The daughter he had spent most of his life overlooking. The daughter he had always considered second best. The daughter he never expected much from. I shook the Admiral's hand. Thank you, sir. The Admiral smiled. It's an honor to have you here. And just like that, the memory I'd spent decades trying to bury came rushing back. Because moments like this don't begin at the White House. They begin years earlier. Usually in places nobody notices. In my case, it began in a small town in Virginia. A town with one stoplight, one grocery store, and one father who never wanted a daughter. At least that was how it often felt. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 38 years old. And for most of my life, I was invisible inside my own family. My father wasn't a cruel man, at least not in the way people usually imagine. He never hit me. He never abandoned us. He worked hard, paid the bills, showed up every day. From the outside, he looked like a good father. The problem was what happened inside the house, especially after my younger brother, Michael, was born. Dad adored Michael. Everything changed when that little boy arrived. The way Dad looked at him, the way he spoke about him, the way his entire face lit up whenever Michael entered a room. Even as a little girl, I noticed the difference. Children always notice. Adults think they're hiding it. They aren't. I remember bringing home a perfect spelling test in 3rd grade. I was so excited. I ran into the kitchen holding the paper. Dad, look. He glanced at it for maybe 2 seconds. Good job. Then he looked back at Michael. How was baseball practice, buddy? That was it. No celebration. No pride, no conversation, just good job. I stood there holding the paper, waiting, but nothing else came. Years later, I would realize that moment wasn't unusual. It was normal. The wall in our living room told the story better than words ever could. Michael's baseball trophies covered the shelves. His photographs filled the frames. His certificates hung proudly where every visitor could see them. There wasn't a single picture of my accomplishments. Not one. When relatives visited, Dad would proudly walk them through Michael's achievements. Future star athlete, he'd say. Meanwhile, I could be standing 3 feet away, and nobody asked about me. At first, I thought maybe I wasn't trying hard enough. Maybe if I earned better grades. Maybe if I worked harder. Maybe if I achieved something extraordinary. Maybe then Dad would finally see me. Children are funny that way. They almost always blame themselves. The only person who seemed to understand was my mother, Sarah Carter. My mother had the gentlest voice I've ever heard. She wasn't loud, she wasn't dramatic. But somehow she always knew exactly what someone needed, especially me. One evening after another baseball game where Dad spent the entire drive home praising Michael, I sat quietly in my room. I was 12, old enough to understand disappointment, young enough to still hope things might change. Mom knocked softly on my door. Can I come in? I nodded. She sat beside me on the bed. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then she reached over and tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear. You're hurting. It wasn't a question. It was a fact. I stared at the floor. I'm fine, she smiled gently. No, you're not. The tears came immediately. I hated that. I hated crying. But somehow Mom always saw through me. He doesn't care about anything I do, I whispered. She stayed quiet, carefully choosing her words. Finally, she said something I've never forgotten. Your father loves you. I looked up. I wasn't sure I believed it, she continued. But sometimes people carry old ideas they don't know how to let go of. What does that mean? She sighed. It means he thinks sons and daughters are different. I laughed bitterly. They are. No, she said softly. Not in the ways that matter. Then she took my hand. Emily, listen to me. I looked at her. One day you'll show them who you are. I remember rolling my eyes. It sounded like something mothers say, the kind of thing that belongs on greeting cards, but she squeezed my hand firmly and for the first time I realized she truly believed it. Not hoped, believed. Years passed. The gap between Michael and me grew wider. Dad spent thousands helping him chase sports dreams, travel teams, equipment, private coaching. Anything Michael wanted. Money always appeared. When I needed things, the answer was usually different. We can't afford it. At 14, I started babysitting. At 15, I worked weekends. At 16, I bought most of my own school supplies. I never complained, at least not out loud. But sometimes, I wondered what it felt like to be chosen, to be someone's favorite, to walk into a room and know you mattered. Then life delivered the hardest blow of all. The person who believed in me began getting sick. At first, Mom hid it. Then she couldn't. Doctor visits became hospital visits. Hospital visits became treatments. Treatments became long stretches of fear. I watched the strongest person I knew grow weaker. And no matter how hard I prayed, I couldn't stop it. One evening, sitting beside her hospital bed, Mom reached for my hand. Her grip was weaker than before. But her eyes were steady, confident, certain. Promise me something. What? Never let anyone decide what you're worth. I tried not to cry. I promise. She smiled. The same smile that had carried me through every disappointment, every lonely moment, every silent dinner table. Then she whispered the words that would follow me for the rest of my life. One day they'll see who you really are. At the time, I thought she meant my father. I thought she meant my family. I didn't yet understand. She was talking about something much bigger. And neither of us knew how little time we had left. The last conversation I had with my mother replayed in my mind for years. Sometimes when I was driving, sometimes when I couldn't sleep, sometimes when life felt impossible, especially after she was gone. My mother passed away 3 months before my high school graduation. I was 17. At that age, you're old enough to understand death, but not old enough to understand how to live without someone you love. The morning of her funeral, our house felt strangely quiet. People filled every room. Neighbors, relatives, church friends. Everyone spoke softly. Everyone offered condolences. But all I could think was that the one person who always noticed me was no longer there. For the first time in my life, I truly felt alone. After the funeral, life moved on for everyone else. Or at least it seemed that way. Dad buried himself in work. Michael buried himself in sports. And I buried myself in school. The house felt colder without Mom. Not physically, emotionally. She had been the bridge between everyone. The person who softened harsh words. The person who remembered birthdays. The person who made a house feel like a home. Without her, every difference became more obvious. Especially the difference between how Dad treated Michael and how he treated me. A month after Mom's death, I found a letter she had hidden inside an old cedar chest. It was addressed to me. The envelope looked worn, as if she had touched it many times before deciding where to leave it. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a short handwritten note. The paper carried the faint scent of her perfume. Even now I can almost smell it. The letter wasn't long, only a few paragraphs, but one sentence changed my life. Never let someone else's opinion become your destiny. I read those words over and over. At first through tears, then through determination, eventually through hope. I folded the letter fully and carried it with me everywhere for years. Sometimes literally, sometimes only in my heart. Graduation arrived that spring. Most families celebrated. Mine felt fractured. I remember walking across the stage to receive my diploma. The auditorium was packed, parents cheering, families taking photographs, people smiling. I searched the crowd instinctively, looking for Mom. For just a second, I forgot. Then reality returned. The empty seat beside Dad felt larger than the entire auditorium. I accepted my diploma, smiled for the camera, and fought back tears. Afterward, relatives congratulated Michael on his latest baseball achievement. Few people asked about my future. I had grown used to that. By then, disappointment no longer surprised me. It simply became part of life. College seemed impossible financially. Dad had already made it clear where most of the family's resources were going. Michael's athletic ambitions continued to receive support. Mine were considered optional. One evening, I sat at the kitchen table filling out scholarship applications. Stacks of paperwork covered every surface. Essays, financial forms, recommendation letters. Dad walked past. He glanced at the papers. "What are those scholarship applications?" He nodded, then shrugged. That's probably your only chance. Not cruel. Not encouraging. Just matter of fact. The kind of statement that stays with you. For a moment, I almost quit. Almost. Then I remembered Mom's letter and I kept writing. Every night after work, every weekend, every spare moment, I applied for everything. Academic scholarships, leadership scholarships, community grants, programs I'd never even heard of before. Months later, the letters started arriving. One acceptance, then another, then another. Eventually, I had enough financial aid to attend college, not because anyone handed me an opportunity, because I chased every opportunity myself. College wasn't easy. Most students spent weekends socializing. I spent mine working, waitressing, tutoring, stocking shelves, whatever paid the bills. I learned how to stretch every dollar, how to survive setbacks, how to keep going when nobody was cheering. Oddly enough, that became my advantage. Many people work hard when someone believes in them. I learned how to work hard when nobody did. That skill changes a person. It teaches resilience. It teaches discipline. It teaches independence. Most importantly, it teaches you that external validation is unreliable. Some days you'll receive it, some days you won't. Either way, the work must continue. During my second year of college, Michael suffered a serious shoulder injury. His baseball dreams began slipping away. For the first time, I saw something unexpected in my father. Fear, not fear for me, fear for Michael. The future he had imagined for his son was suddenly uncertain. Dad became restless, frustrated, angry. He had spent years investing emotionally in a single vision. Now that vision was collapsing. Meanwhile, I was quietly building a future nobody had planned. Nobody, except Mom. One afternoon, while organizing old family photographs, I found a picture of her sitting on our front porch. She was smiling, holding a cup of coffee, looking directly into the camera. For reasons I still can't fully explain, I sat down and stared at that photograph for nearly an hour. I imagined what she would say if she could see me working, studying, pushing forward, still trying, still refusing to quit. I think she'd be proud. Not because of any achievement, but because I kept going. That thought carried me through some difficult years. By the time I graduated college, I had developed a quiet confidence. Not arrogance, not revenge, something stronger. The understanding that my worth didn't depend on anyone else's approval. Not my father's, not society's, not anyone's. And that realization changed everything because shortly after graduation, an opportunity appeared that would alter the entire course of my life. An opportunity that would eventually carry me all the way to Washington. An opportunity my father never saw coming. An opportunity that started with 4 simple words. United States Navy recruiting. The first time I walked into a Navy recruiting office, I wasn't looking for adventure. I was looking for a future. The small office sat in a shopping plaza between a tax service and a sandwich shop. It wasn't glamorous. There were no dramatic movie moments. Just a few desks, some posters, and a recruiter who asked me a simple question. What are you hoping to accomplish? Nobody had ever asked me that before. Not seriously. Not as if my answer mattered. I thought about it for a moment. Then I said, I want to earn something nobody can take away from me. The recruiter nodded slowly. That's a good reason. A few months later, I raised my right hand and took the oath. My father didn't attend. He wasn't against it. He simply wasn't interested. Michael came because he happened to be free that day. Dad called later that evening. Be careful. That was the entire conversation. Meanwhile, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the small Navy pin they'd given me. Part of me wished my mother could see it. She would have understood what it meant. Not the uniform, the opportunity, the chance to become someone on my own terms. Training was harder than anything I'd experienced. Not just physically, mentally, emotionally. The Navy doesn't care where you came from. It doesn't care about excuses. It doesn't care about your childhood. It demands performance every day. And I loved that. For the first time in my life, expectations were clear. Work hard, learn, improve, earn respect. Nobody asked whether I was someone's daughter. Nobody compared me to my brother. Nobody cared. Results spoke for themselves. That felt liberating. Of course, not everyone welcomed me. Some people looked at a young woman and assumed she wouldn't last. Others assumed she couldn't lead. I learned quickly that arguing rarely changed minds. Performance did. So, I stopped trying to convince people. Instead, I focused on becoming excellent. When others relaxed, I studied. When others complained, I prepared. When others doubted me, I worked. Slowly, things began to change. The people who underestimated me started asking for help. The supervisors who barely noticed me started paying attention, and the opportunities started coming. My first promotion felt incredible. Not because of the rank, because I had earned it. Every late night, every sacrifice, every difficult moment, it all mattered. I called Dad to share the news. There was a long pause after I told him. "That's nice," he said. The exact same words he'd used when I brought home that spelling test years earlier. For a second, I almost laughed. Some things never changed. We talked for another minute before hanging up. Then I sat quietly in my apartment, not angry, just aware. Aware that I was still hoping for something he didn't know how to give. Approval, pride, recognition. The older I got, the more I understood that parents are human beings. They carry their own limitations, their own blind spots, their own unfinished stories. Understanding that didn't erase the hurt, but it helped me stop expecting miracles. Meanwhile, Michael's life was becoming increasingly complicated. After his baseball career ended, he bounced between opportunities. One business idea after another, one plan after another, each one promising success, most of them ending in disappointment. Dad continued helping him financially, emotionally, practically. I sometimes wondered what my life would have looked like if I'd received even half that support. Then I would stop myself. Comparison is a dangerous habit. It steals gratitude. And by then I had plenty to be grateful for. My career continued advancing. I served under leaders who taught me invaluable lessons. Some were demanding, some were inspiring, a few were both. The best leaders shared one quality. They noticed people, not titles, not backgrounds, people. I tried to learn from them. Years passed. Assignments came and went. I moved across the country several times, made lifelong friends, lost a few along the way, experienced triumphs and setbacks like everyone else. But each challenge strengthened something inside me. Confidence. Not loud confidence, quiet confidence. The kind built through experience. The kind nobody can fake. One deployment changed everything. Without discussing details, our team became involved in a humanitarian response effort after a devastating natural disaster. Thousands of families needed help. Entire communities had been destroyed. For weeks, we worked around the clock. Not because anyone ordered us to, because people needed us. I watched service members carry elderly citizens to safety, deliver supplies, comfort frightened children, solve impossible problems. It reminded me why I loved serving. At its best, leadership isn't about authority. It's about responsibility. Years later, that mission would unexpectedly become part of a nomination package submitted on my behalf. At the time, I had no idea. I was simply doing my job. The years continued passing. Promotion followed promotion. Assignment followed assignment. Somewhere along the way, I stopped trying to prove my father wrong. That surprised me. For years, I thought success would feel like revenge. It didn't. Success felt like freedom. The freedom to stop carrying old wounds. The freedom to become my own person. One evening, after a particularly long day, I returned home and found a large envelope waiting in my mailbox. The return address said Washington, D.C. I assumed it was routine military correspondence, probably paperwork, maybe an administrative issue. I almost tossed it onto the kitchen counter unopened. Instead, I made a cup of coffee and sat down. Then I opened the envelope. Inside was an official invitation. At first I thought there must be some mistake. I read it once, then twice, then a third time. My heart started racing. The letter informed me that I had been selected for a prestigious national recognition honoring exceptional military leadership and public service. The ceremony would take place in Washington at the White House. For several minutes, I simply stared at the page. Then my eyes drifted toward the framed photograph of my mother sitting on that porch years earlier. I smiled, and for the first time in a very long time I whispered words I wished she could hear. "Mom, they finally noticed." For a long time I simply sat there staring at the invitation. The coffee on my kitchen table had gone cold. Outside the sun was beginning to set, but I barely noticed. My eyes kept returning to the same words. The White House. The invitation felt unreal. Not because I doubted my career. By then I had accomplished more than the 17-year-old version of me could have imagined. But the White House belonged in history books, news broadcasts, presidential speeches. It didn't feel like a place someone like me was supposed to end up. Not a girl from a tiny Virginia town. Not a daughter who had spent half her life trying to be noticed. I eventually laughed at myself. Then, I read the letter again, this time more carefully. The recognition wasn't for one assignment or one achievement. It reflected years of leadership service and community impact. Somewhere along the way, people had been paying attention even when I wasn't. That realization touched me more than the invitation itself. The next day, I called the number listed in the letter. The woman who answered was professional and friendly. After verifying several details, she confirmed everything. No mistake, no misunderstanding. I was expected in Washington. The ceremony was real. After hanging up, I sat quietly for a while. Then I picked up my phone and called Dad. Part of me considered not telling him, not out of spite, simply because we weren't particularly close. But something inside me said I should. He answered on the third ring. "Hello, Dad. I received an invitation from Washington." "Washington?" "Yes." There was a pause. "What kind of invitation?" I explained. Not dramatically, just the facts. By the time I finished, his entire tone had changed. "The White House. That's right." Another pause, then another. For the first time in years, he sounded genuinely impressed. "Well, that's something." I smiled slightly. It wasn't exactly enthusiasm, but it was progress. Over the following days, he called more than usual. That alone felt strange. Then came the question I should have expected. Do family members attend these things? I laughed. Sometimes. Would there be room for me? There it was. The same man who had barely asked about my promotions suddenly wanted details. Old resentment briefly surfaced, then faded. I surprised myself by saying yes. After all, this wasn't about revenge, at least not anymore. A few days later, he called back. I got my invitation. The excitement in his voice was impossible to miss. For a moment, I felt like a child again, not because he was proud of me, because he was proud of the event. There is a difference. Still, I let it go. Life is easier when you stop demanding perfection from imperfect people. A week before the trip, I drove to Virginia to visit him. The old family house looked smaller than I remembered. Funny how that happens. Places shrink when memories grow. Dad was waiting on the porch. Older now, his hair mostly gray, his movement slower. For the first time, I noticed signs of age that had once seemed impossible. Growing old has a way of humbling everyone, even fathers. Michael was there, too. We sat around the kitchen table drinking coffee. For the most part, the conversation stayed pleasant. Michael asked questions about my work. Dad asked questions about Washington. Mostly Washington. What exactly is this ceremony? Who will be there? Will there be military leaders? The more he talked, the more excited he became. By the end of dinner, he seemed more invested than I was. The irony wasn't lost on me. Years ago, he could barely remember details about my achievements. Now he was practically planning the trip. That night I stayed in my old bedroom. Most of my childhood belongings were gone, but a few remained, including a small wooden box. Inside was my mother's letter, the original, folded carefully, protected all these years. I sat on the edge of the bed and read it again. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, but the words remained powerful. Never let someone else's opinion become your destiny. I smiled, then looked around the room. This room had witnessed so many disappointments, so many tears, so many moments of self-doubt. Yet somehow, it had also witnessed determination, growth, persistence. The young girl who once cried herself to sleep in that room would never have believed where life was headed. The following week arrived quickly. Soon we were boarding a flight to Washington. Dad seemed unusually cheerful, like a man heading toward an important personal achievement. At the airport, he proudly told strangers about the White House event. A few people congratulated him. He accepted their congratulations without correcting them. I noticed, but said nothing. Old habits die hard. When we arrived in Washington, the city looked beautiful. Historic buildings, tree-lined streets, monuments rising against the skyline. Even after years of travel, Washington still felt special. That evening, we checked into our hotel. The lobby buzzed with guests attending various government and military functions. Dad spent half the evening talking with other attendees. Whenever someone asked why he was there, he proudly mentioned the White House. Sometimes he mentioned me, sometimes he didn't. I found myself oddly amused. Not angry, just amused. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. Years in the Navy had made early morning second nature. I stood by the hotel window, watching the city slowly come alive. Cars moving through the streets, workers heading to jobs, tourists beginning their day, and somewhere beyond the building stood the White House waiting. A strange calm settled over me. Not excitement, not anxiety, gratitude. Whatever happened next, I had already won. Not because of an award, because I had become the person my mother always believed I could be. A few hours later, we dressed and left for the ceremony. Dad carefully adjusted his tie, checked his invitation twice, then slipped it into his jacket pocket. As our car approached the White House grounds, he looked almost giddy. I couldn't help smiling. Neither of us knew it yet, but before the day was over, everything he thought he understood about his daughter was about to change forever. The White House grounds were even more impressive than I remembered. Security checkpoints, uniformed personnel, historic buildings, everything operated with quiet precision. As our car pulled up, my father adjusted his jacket for the third time. He looked excited, proud, important, and in a way, I understood. For a man from a small Virginia town, being invited to a White House ceremony felt like a once-in-a-lifetime experience. We joined the line of guests moving toward the check-in area. Military officers, government officials, family members, decorated veterans. The atmosphere carried a mixture of dignity and anticipation. Dad seemed to enjoy every second of it. As we approached the registration desk, he pulled out his VIP invitation. The gold lettering gleamed under the lights. He held it up almost like a trophy. Then he glanced at me. A familiar smirk appeared, the same one I had seen since childhood. "You weren't invited." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. The sting came from decades of history behind them. For a brief moment, 1-7-year-old Emily reappeared, the girl standing in the kitchen with a perfect spelling test. The girl waiting for approval that never came. The girl who always seemed to come second, but only for a moment because I wasn't that girl anymore. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply handed my invitation to the hostess. She smiled politely and scanned the QR code. The scanner beeped. Then her smile vanished. She looked at the screen, looked at me, then looked at the screen again. Her expression changed completely. She froze, then turned toward a senior Navy Admiral standing nearby. "Sir." The Admiral looked up. "She's here." For a second, nobody moved. Then everything happened at once. The Admiral immediately started walking toward me. Several officials nearby followed. The hostess stepped aside. Guests began turning their heads. My father stared in confusion. I could see him trying to understand what was happening. The Admiral stopped directly in front of me. A broad smile spread across his face. "Commander Carter." He extended his hand. "It's an honor to finally meet you." I shook it. "Thank you, sir." He gestured toward the entrance. "We've been waiting for you." The words seemed to hang in the air. "We've been waiting for you. Not your father. Not some dignitary. Not a politician. Me?" Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my father standing completely still. For perhaps the first time in his life, he had no idea what to say. The Admiral turned to him politely. "You must be Emily's father." Dad nodded, still processing. The Admiral smiled warmly. "You should be very proud." My father opened his mouth, then closed it. No words came out. The irony wasn't lost on me. For decades, he had struggled to express pride. Now, an admiral had said it for him. We were escorted through the entrance. As we walked, several military leaders greeted me by name. Not because I was famous, not because I was powerful, because they knew my work. They knew the missions, the leadership programs, the humanitarian operations, the years of service. Every conversation left my father looking more stunned. At one point, he leaned closer. "How do these people know you?" I smiled. "We've worked together." He nodded slowly, as though trying to fit a lifetime of missing information into a few short minutes. Eventually, we entered the main hall. The room was beautiful. Flags, military banners, rows of carefully arranged seating. Everything carried the weight of history. An usher approached. "Commander Carter, right this way." She guided me toward the front section. Very front. Not guest seating, not family seating. The honor section. Dad stopped walking. "What is this?" I turned toward him. "This is where they asked me to sit." His eyes widened. For the first time all day, the reality began settling in. I wasn't attending the ceremony. I was one of the reasons it existed. A few moments later, the program began. Senior officials took the stage. Speeches followed. Recognition followed. Awards followed. Then my name was announced. The room erupted into applause. For a second, I simply sat there. Not because I was surprised, because I was overwhelmed. The applause wasn't for one achievement. It wasn't for one day. It represented years. Years of effort, years of sacrifice, years of becoming the person my mother believed I could be. As I walked toward the stage, my eyes drifted toward the audience, toward my father. He wasn't applauding politely. He wasn't pretending. He looked emotional. Genuinely emotional. I had never seen that expression before, not directed at me. The citation was read aloud. Leadership, service, mentorship, humanitarian impact, community involvement. Each accomplishment sounded strangely distant, as if they belonged to someone else. But they didn't. They belonged to the girl who bought her own school supplies. The girl who studied while others doubted her. The girl who carried her mother's letter through some of the hardest years of her life. When the presentation concluded, another round of applause filled the room. I returned to my seat. The Admiral leaned over. "Your mother would be proud." The words hit harder than anything else that day. Harder than the recognition. Harder than the applause. Harder than the honor itself. Because he was right. And suddenly, I wished more than anything that she could be sitting beside my father, watching, smiling, knowing she had been right all along. The ceremony continued. But for my father, something fundamental had already changed. The daughter he once overlooked had become impossible to overlook. And for the first time, he was finally seeing her clearly. When the ceremony finally ended, people gathered throughout the hall in small groups. Some exchanged business cards, some posed for photographs, others simply stood together enjoying the moment. I spent nearly an hour shaking hands and speaking with people I respected. Military leaders, public servants, veterans, community organizers. The conversations were meaningful, but my attention kept drifting toward my father. He stood near the back of the room, quiet, almost withdrawn. That alone felt unusual. My father had never been a quiet man, especially not around people. Yet now he seemed lost in thought, as if he had just discovered something he should have known years ago. Eventually, the crowd began thinning. The Admiral stopped by before leaving. "It was a privilege honoring you today, Commander." "Thank you, sir." He shook my hand, then glanced toward my father. The Admiral smiled kindly. "You raised an extraordinary daughter." My father lowered his eyes. For a moment, he looked almost embarrassed. After the Admiral left, neither of us spoke. We simply stood there surrounded by history, surrounded by people, yet somehow alone with our thoughts. Finally, Dad cleared his throat. "I didn't know." His voice sounded smaller than usual. I looked at him. "What didn't you know?" He gave a sad laugh. "Any of it." For years, I had imagined this moment. Imagined what I would say if he ever admitted it. I expected anger, vindication, maybe even satisfaction. Instead, I felt tired. Not physically, emotionally. Old wounds lose some of their sharpness with time. What remains is usually sadness. "I know," I said softly. That seemed to hurt him more than any accusation could have. We left the building together. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grounds. The air felt warm, peaceful. People walked slowly between the pathways and gardens. Dad suggested we take a walk before returning to the hotel. I agreed. For several minutes we said nothing. Then he stopped beside a bench. "I owe you an apology." The words came out awkwardly as if he had never practiced them. Maybe he hadn't. I waited. He sat down heavily, staring at the ground. "When you were little, I thought I understood how life worked." I listened quietly. "I thought sons carried the family name." He laughed bitterly. "I thought sons were supposed to accomplish great things." The irony hung between us. I spent years believing things that weren't true. For the first time in my life, I saw genuine regret in his face. Not defensiveness, not excuses. Regret. The kind that comes when someone realizes they cannot get back lost years. He rubbed his hands together slowly. I kept waiting for Michael to become the person I imagined. His voice cracked slightly, and while I was doing that, I completely missed who you already were. The words hit harder than I expected, not because they were dramatic, because they were honest. For a moment, neither of us spoke. A nearby flag moved gently in the breeze. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear faint traffic. Life continuing, as it always does. Dad stared ahead. I remember your spelling test. I blinked. Of all things, I hadn't expected that. The one in 3rd grade. I nodded slowly. You remember that? He swallowed. I remember your face. For years I thought he hadn't noticed. Apparently he had. That realization surprised me. I knew I disappointed you. He looked down. I just never admitted it. I didn't know what to say. Because the truth was complicated. Parents can hurt their children deeply. Sometimes intentionally. Sometimes without realizing it. The damage feels the same either way. But age teaches something important. Most people aren't villains. They're flawed human beings carrying outdated beliefs, fears, and mistakes. My father wasn't evil. He was wrong. And sometimes wrong can hurt just as much. We continued walking. Eventually, we reached a quiet garden area. Dad stopped again. I think your mother knew. I knew that you were special. A smile touched my face. She did. He nodded. I should have listened to her. For years, Mom had challenged him gently, patiently, without anger. She had seen things he refused to see. Potential, too. Strength, determination. Dad looked toward the trees. She used to tell me all the time. I smiled. What? One day you'll see what that girl is capable of. The words nearly took my breath away because they sounded exactly like her. I could hear her voice clear as day. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt necessary, like a bridge slowly being rebuilt, one board at a time. Eventually, Dad turned toward me. His eyes were moist. I can't get those years back. No, I can't change how I treated you. No. He nodded sadly, then asked the question that mattered. But can we move forward? For a long moment, I looked at him. The man who had disappointed me. The man who had failed me. The man who was finally trying. And suddenly, I realized something. Forgiveness isn't about pretending the past never happened. It's about refusing to let the past control the future. I thought about my mother, what she would say, what she would want. Then I smiled. A small smile, but a genuine one. Yeah, Dad. His shoulders relaxed. For the first time all day, he looked relieved. Truly relieved. Neither of us knew exactly what the future would look like. But for the first time, we were walking toward it together. The flight home felt very different from the flight to Washington. On the way there, my father had spent most of the trip talking about the White House, the guests, the ceremony, the prestige. On the way back, he spent most of the trip talking about my mother. I didn't mind. In fact, I welcomed it. For years, mentioning Mom had carried a quiet sadness. Now it felt comforting, like opening a window in a room that had been closed too long. At one point during the flight, Dad stared out the window and smiled. You know what I remember most? What? The way she'd look at you. I laughed softly. What does that mean? He shook his head. She looked at you like she already knew. Knew what? Everything. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he added quietly, she saw things the rest of us missed. That was probably the most honest thing he had ever said about my mother. After we landed, life slowly returned to normal. At least on the surface. I returned to work. Dad returned home. Michael returned to his own family. But something had changed. Not overnight. Not magically. Relationships rarely work that way. The change happened gradually. A phone call here, a visit there, a conversation that would never have happened before. For the first time in my life, my father began asking questions about me. Not out of obligation, out of genuine interest. The first few times, it felt strange, almost uncomfortable. I wasn't used to it. Neither was he. But we kept trying. One afternoon, a few months later, Dad called unexpectedly. Are you free this weekend? I think so. I was wondering if you'd like to visit your mother's grave. I sat quietly for a moment. Yeah, I'd like that. Saturday arrived bright and clear. The cemetery sat on a gentle hill outside town, peaceful, simple, the kind of place where time seems to slow down. Dad and I walked together carrying a small bouquet of white flowers, the same kind Mom used to plant beside the front porch every spring. As we approached the grave, a familiar ache settled in my chest. Not as sharp as it once was, but still there. Some losses never completely disappear. You simply learn how to carry them. We stood silently for several moments. The wind moved softly through the trees. Birds sang somewhere nearby. The world continued exactly as it always had. Dad reached into his jacket pocket. Then he removed something carefully folded. I immediately recognized it. The official White House ceremony program, the one he had carried home. Without saying a word, he placed it gently beside the flowers. Then he looked down at the headstone. His voice trembled slightly. "You were right," the words hung in the air. Simple, honest, long overdue. Dad swallowed hard. I should have listened. For a moment, I thought he might cry. Part of me almost did. Not because of the White House, not because of the award, because after all these years, he finally understood what my mother had known from the beginning. Potential doesn't belong to sons or daughters. It belongs to people. And every child deserves to be seen. Dad stood there for a long time, longer than either of us expected. Finally, he looked at me. I wasted a lot of years. I nodded, maybe. He gave a sad smile. I did. Then he surprised me. But I'm grateful for the years we still have. That simple sentence meant more than any apology, because it wasn't focused on the past. It was focused on the future, and that's where healing begins. Not in regret, in choice. The choice to do better. The choice to love better. The choice to see people for who they are instead of who we expect them to be. Over the following year, our relationship continued improving, not perfectly. No family is perfect. We still disagreed sometimes. We still had difficult conversations. But there was honesty now. Respect. Effort. The things that matter most. One evening after a family dinner, Dad pulled me aside. The grandchildren were playing in the backyard. Michael was helping clean up dishes. For once, nobody was competing for attention. Nobody was being compared. Everyone was simply enjoying each other's company. Dad looked around and smiled. "You know something?" "What?" "I used to think success looked like trophies." I laughed. "Yeah, I noticed." He laughed too. Then his expression softened. I was wrong. He looked directly at me. "Success looks like this: family, connection, peace." It was one of the few times in my life I saw complete contentment in his face, and for the first time I understood something important. The White House ceremony had never really been the victory. The award wasn't the victory. The recognition wasn't the victory. The real victory was becoming the person I wanted to be without becoming bitter along the way. The real victory was proving my mother's faith was justified. The real victory was finding enough grace to forgive. Years ago, I thought success would finally make my father see me. What I learned instead was that success doesn't change who you are. It reveals who you've become. And because of my mother's love, I became someone stronger than my pain, someone bigger than old disappointments. Someone capable of building bridges where walls once stood. If you're listening to this story today, perhaps you've known what it feels like to be overlooked. Perhaps you've carried old wounds from a parent, a sibling, a friend, or even life itself. If so, I hope you remember this. Never let someone else's opinion become your destiny. The people who underestimate you do not get to define you. And sometimes the greatest form of revenge isn't proving someone wrong. It's building a beautiful life anyway. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on someone who believed in you when nobody else did. Share their memory, share their wisdom. And if you'd like to hear more stories about resilience, forgiveness, and second chances, we'd love to have you join us again. Because sometimes the people who change our lives are gone long before we understand what they gave us. My father saw my success at the White House, but my mother saw it long before anyone.